In this lesson, we're going to be talking about why infographics are so appealing and when is a good time to use them. We're also going to talk about where to start when you want to make one of your own. Before we get started, I'd just like to let you know that Digital Tutors would like to say thank you to iStockPhoto and the artists Cinnabee, Nicholas _ and Titles Pics for their images that were used in this series of lessons. You can access these same images and thousands of others at www.istockphoto.com. Okay, so I'm just going to be going through some infographics as we talk about some of these topics just to kind of get the ball rolling for you, maybe help to spark your ideas, maybe inspire you a little bit. So this first one that we're looking at here is called Why Wilderness, and it was published by the Wilderness Society and designed by Column 5 Media. Okay, so why are infographics so appealing? You know, you hear about them all the time. We see them in a lot of places. They're becoming more and more common. And the answer is really just simple. If you have a lot of data or a lot of different facts that you need to show, displaying it as an infographic is such a much more appealing way to show it than just having a big list of, text, maybe a few pictures or a few really plain graphs. Whenever you've designed it to all fit together like this, it really takes on a much more appealing look. So really the reason is just that humans are visual creatures. We communicate visually. That transcends language. And even though this has things written on it, you can still figure out from a lot of these pictures what this is talking about, what's it endorsing. You get a pretty good idea just from looking at the images that we see here. So infographics provide a way to communicate in a way that appeals to the visual learner. And by having well-designed infographics, you can quickly communicate a complex message. And it happens in a fun and beautiful way, so you gotta love that. I'll keep kind of scrolling down through here. So imagine, if you had to explain something like maybe how a pen and paper work together, and that's pretty simple, but you could only use words. That could maybe be kind of hard. You'd have to write it out, and you don't know if the people would still get it. Sometimes just showing is a better way to go. So, if you were only talking, you didn't get to write that down, and you couldn't use your hands with any gestures, it becomes more and more difficult. So we're taking that variable out by giving ourselves the opportunity to display a lot of these things, in a visual way. So here's the next one here. It's a lot different format, not quite so long as that last one we were looking at. This is something that's more almost like a poster, but we do have a lot of data that's described here. So infographics differ from posters in that they are communicating something a little more complex than maybe just, maybe a poster that you would think of as maybe like for a concert or something where you kind of have a time where you need to show up, maybe how much the tickets are, and there's not usually a whole lot more information like that on a poster. You can have an infographic on a poster size format, but usually it's just going to contain a lot more data. So let's talk about what makes a good infographic. So if you're choosing, what am I going to make my infographic about? It needs to be something that people care about. So you don't want to just choose some random thing that nobody is going to be changed by. Also, if people don't care, why would you want to waste your time creating it? Another thing that can sometimes be difficult to avoid when you're designing an infographic, especially if you're looking at a lot of other infographics for inspiration, is to not copy exactly what you see. So sometimes that can be kind of difficult. So it's better sometimes to get your inspiration from your information instead of just looking at a lot of other infographics and reiterating something else. And also choosing a unique topic. So there's so many infographics out there about things that you've seen before, things like debt. That's a hot topic. So if you do choose to create an infographic like that, how are you going to make yours stand out? These are all questions that you just need to ask yourself whenever you start to create your own. Now, let's talk a little bit about that beginning process of starting your own infographic. This is a great one to have as an example here because we've got a lot of different kinds of information and they're displayed in some different ways. So where do you get this information from? Well, if you're starting completely from scratch, you're definitely going to need to do some research. So the first thing you have to do, obviously, is get your idea. Your steps are going to vary, based on whether or not you have your research already done for you. If you're going somewhere and or maybe you have a infographic that you need to design, but you've already just been handed all of the information that you have to use. It's really going to depend on your project and the guidelines that you end up with and kind of just where you end up starting from. But if you're starting from scratch, getting your idea first is obviously the very first step. But it can kind of be overlooked because for our project, whenever I started it, we're going to be doing ours about coral reefs. Are we going to do this about all coral reefs and have an overview? Are we going to focus in on one specific thing, like maybe just talk about the Great Barrier Reef? Are we only going to talk about how coral is being destroyed? Or are we going to talk about the other things related to it? You have to narrow that idea down. So just saying, I want to do it about, one thing that could be a really broad topic may end up in you having a larger infographic. Now that ultimately was the way that I ended up going for our infographic that we'll be creating in this course today. But if you need it to be smaller, you have to limit your information. So you may need to kind of pare down your idea a little bit, maybe make it a little bit more manageable, not try to cover so many things. And that's going to help you in your research to not do, too much research so you can get started on your design. Now, another thing for your idea is you need to go in there and establish your tone. Are you going to be making this funny? Is it going to be educational? Is it going to be serious? Is it going to be dark? You need to figure this out from the beginning because sometimes, you can maybe have one thing that just seems kind of out of place if you are inspired maybe by one thing and you kind of have this modular thing going on. It's really easy to get carried away. When I say modular, I just mean, this is obviously one part. This is another part. This is another part. So if this felt, way different from all the other parts in its tone, it's not going to be as cohesive as it possibly could have been. So get that established early on. You also need to figure out who your audience is. That's going to help to establish that tone. So, if this is being targeted at children, you probably don't want to use a whole lot of really, really big words. Just things like that. Keep that in mind. Now, here comes the part where you would do your research. Are you going to be researching this yourself? We kind of talked about this earlier. That's going to depend, on kind of where you start. But if you're doing your research yourself, make sure you use verifiable data, especially if it's a data-driven infographic. If you're a student and you want to find a topic to use and then kind of get some data, a great resource is howstuffworks.com, and there's also so many other places out there that you can find ideas and data to work from. Just make sure it's something that's verifiable, and if it's an article you're looking at, make sure it's something that definitely checked their facts and everything that they're saying in that article would be true. Now, the next part is developing your content. So to develop your content, you kind of get your first idea. Let's say for our idea, or let's say for this infographic, the age of exploration, life on the open seas. That's their idea. Then they have to start going in here and figuring out their content. So maybe they did some research, got an idea of some of the things they could talk about, and it looks kind of like they took a day in the life approach. So a hard day's work here at the top, just kind of an overview of that. You're kind of establishing, some bullet points here. This is the next kind of main block. And then some, another block down here. So they kind of have 3, maybe 4 if you count this one as another part, but there's obviously 3 headings here. So that's kind of the next part of developing your content, figuring out what these headers are and then what's going to go underneath those as content. So the content that we're going to be using is going to be kind of, start out with some fun facts about coral reefs, and just kind of go from there. It's going to be generally an overview of everything. So we'll talk more about what those bullet points are later on. Then you need to really go in and refine and flesh out your message. And these are sort of kind of go hand in hand, developing your content and refining that, fleshing that out. Developing your content to you might mean just figuring out what these headers are, and then fleshing it out might be, everything that falls inside here. So that's a pretty large step of the process. And so that may not be something that you end up having to do if your brief is handed to you and you just have the text right from the get-go. So another thing, if you are doing it yourself, use spell check. Type it out in a Word document first. Use spell check, then bring it in. There's so many things that you see out there that have, maybe some small little misspelling. I'm not calling this one out. I'm just generally saying that sometimes there's a misspelling and you're just like, wow, if that's been printed, that's a really easy thing to fix. I shouldn't even have to say it. Then the last step, obviously, is create your design. So at that point, you have all your copy and you're ready to, get started with creating the design. And I can't tell you how much easier it is to create the infographic once you've done that preliminary work. It really is going to take you a lot longer if you just jump right in and start designing without first going in and figuring out what you're trying to say with that design. So the specs that we're going to be using is a client needs an infographic style poster that covers a general overview of coral reefs. And it's going to be printed on 11 by 36. So I'm just kind of getting you started on, these are some of the things that we'll take into consideration when we first start getting that design. Separate your information according to your story. So that's kind of what you did earlier in establishing your content. But again, figuring out, okay, just because the content is set up in a certain way, that I wrote it out, is that how I'm going to present it on my poster? And usually that is a good way to go. It just keeps everything a little more compartmentalized. And this is a really long infographic. There it is. So 11,417 sharks killed per hour, and that was just kind of a representation of how many sharks are killed per hour. So this one, I really like the way that it's been compartmentalized, and you see it kind of uses some images, also has some nice use of illustration combined with photography. So this, I'm just really like the way that this one has been set up, this wilderness one. So we're kind of back to the beginning here. If you're curious about who made any of these infographics, who designed them, there's a text file included in your project files called Credits for Example Infographics. And you would want to check that out just if you want to look further into that. So maybe one of the last things to talk about here is just that, there are so many types of infographics. We just looked at a lot of different ones, and a lot of them can, be considered pretty, and some of them, not necessarily the ones that we looked at, but some infographics can be kind of hard to read because you don't know where to start. So that's going to be something that we talk about in our process, and that's also one of the reasons why I like this one in particular. There's a really obvious starting place here at the top. Just because of the way it's designed in this really vertical manner, you kind of just scroll through it, and if it's written in English, you're reading from left to right, and it just kind of has a really definite eye path. So that's something you got to keep in mind as well. So in this lesson, we learned about that beginning process of getting started with creating your own infographic. We looked at a few examples of different infographics that take lots of different approaches. And we learned why infographics are appealing in the first place and when is a good time to create an infographic for whatever kind of data or content you might need to be presenting.